Okay.
Great.
Hello, everyone. We are about to get started. Thank you for joining us today. I will hand it over to Mark Redwood.
Perfect.
To kick off the webinar.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to have you all on for a Spark webinar, our latest Spark webinar. Just by way of introduction, I'm Mark Redwood. I'm the Executive Director for the Spark program. Spark stands for Supporting Pastoralism and Agriculture in Recurrent and Protracted Crises. And this is a research program which is supported by FCDO, the UK government, as well as Canada's International Development Research Centre. I'm super thrilled today to have this webinar around some of the innovation work that we have been supported under the leadership of Chloe Stoll-Lane, who I'll be passing it over to in a moment. Spark's mandate is to support research around issues associated with pastoralism and agriculture in fragile and conflict-affected states. And one of the issues that comes up over and over is that there are so many things taking place in the drylands, particularly in some of the most conflict-affected places and climate, where climate shocks are quite apparent. Very interesting and innovative ideas that are basically happening on a day-to-day basis. How are people coping with recurrent conflicts? How are people coping with drought? What are people doing in the drylands? And this is one of the elements of research that Spark has really wanted to dig into. Fundamentally, what we are trying to do is shed some light on some of these innovations and figure out if some of these innovations can be replicated in different places and how valuable they might be in terms of providing some insight and guidance to research funders, development practitioners to basically improve practice and basically improve development outcomes. Spark, I should say, is led by Cowater, but we also, of course, partner with ODI in the UK, ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute that many of you will know, and then Mercy Corps. And with that, I will hand it over to Chloe. I'm really looking forward to this, the presentation of this research, this work. It's the culmination of many months of hard effort. And so I'll hand it over to you, Chloe, to present the speakers and to get going on the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to share with you about the Spark Innovation Research Facility, what we've been up to, and then in particular to dive deep into looking at pastoralism, pastoralists on social media, and connectivity in the drylands. So thanks again for joining us. The Spark Innovation Research Facility was set up to co-create, curate, and broker evidence on innovation and innovation systems that build resilience in pastoralist regions. And we do that through investigating different overall questions. Some of those are around research on innovation and practice, understanding more about what innovations hold the most promise, what makes them effective, what we can learn from successful innovations that could be transferred or adapted to other contexts. And then we also do research around enabling environments for innovation to understand what facilitates and constrains innovation in these fragile dryland contexts in particular, and what it needs to be done to use and scale impactful innovations. From all of this, the research really has the aim to influence development policy, humanitarian development partners, and also inform innovators themselves from public and private sector, civil society. On the next slide, we're presenting a bit of information about how we started off the research in the Innovation Research Facility. So we first started with doing a scoping study on innovations across East and West Africa. And we published this report, which is available on the Spark website. And the report clusters the different innovations we found and drew out learnings, showing where innovation has focused and where there are gaps also in innovation. And we continue to do this scoping work through always looking out for additional innovations and adding them to our innovation dashboard. So the innovation dashboard is an open source dashboard. It's on the Spark website. And anyone is allowed to submit additional innovations for review. And we're always keen to learn more about innovations we haven't captured yet. So if you are aware of any innovation happening in pastoralist drylands, please do submit it there, and we'll be in touch to learn more and see if there might be ways to collaborate around learning objectives together and amplify some of the innovation that's happening. Then from this dashboard, we selected different innovation to do research with. And so those innovations currently are in two different categories. There's a couple of innovations that we're researching around governance innovation, one on the shared process led by the World Agroforestry Center, and one on the word development planning process with Mercy Corps in Kenya. And then 3 studies that have to do with digital innovation. We're working with Dalberg Research to map out digital services, both information, financial services that are available in the drylands and their levels of utilization. We're doing some research with Upper Scouts, which is a mobile application that gives geosatellite data and grazing advice to pastoralists while allowing pastoralists to share with each other additional information to make better decisions. And then the research that we are presenting today, which is with Wowzy and Nendo. And this is a really exciting innovation around how to engage with social media and to reach out to pastoralists and campaign and also interact with pastoralists in the social media space. So with that, I'd love to introduce our speakers today to you. Who will tell us a lot more about the project that we've been doing. So Mark Kaigwa, who's the founding and managing director at Nendo and a research advisory service working on social media and digital across Africa. Mike Otieno, the Wowzy co-founder, who's been working on building campaigns and learning more and more with us about what kinds of campaigns could work best in the drylands. And Alexis, who has been on the Spark side leading our research on partnership together. So with that, I'd love to hand it over to Mark to give a review of pastoralists and social media.
Sure, and thank you, Chloe, and my appreciation to the whole team for the opportunity to come and share these findings with you. So just to introduce a bit of what I'm about to share, my view and what I'm hoping to present here are a couple thought starters that came up from some of the work that, as Chloe has said, we had the chance to look at when it comes to the drylands in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Nigeria, and specifically with the question of what are some of the cross-cutting themes that are there when it comes to digital in particular that would be worth us paying special attention to. So I think the first of these, and really a recurring theme, is that investments in connectivity continue to hopefully pay fruit over the decades to come. So we have, for example, a high-speed undersea cable called To Africa that's expected to bring more connectivity than dozens of other Pan-African cables, and you see all the colors here. And the smartphone really is ending up as one of the key devices all projections expect that's going to transform things. So there's an element here of investments in connectivity and hopefully a leapfrogging. So away from the QWERTY keyboard some of you are joining this Zoom call from, to the phone as a really important daily driver and touch point for the internet and for access to information, even as far as the drylands. Next slide, please. However, I think with that connectivity comes some constraints and some aspects where the continent's still being held back to some degree. So one thing you'd have noticed from the previous slide is that many of these undersea cables are making landfall in coastal countries. So landlocked countries do tend to lag, and particularly those with drylands. So what we find is the further away the drylands are and the more remote, the more you tend to find that there's an element of under-connectivity. There's also an aspect here of what level of competition there is between the telcos, because that helps to at least drive some market dynamics that will drive the price down. So this isn't always the case, and it does depend from country to country. So what I think we see in this particular case here is that you have countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, Mali, Zambia, Burkina Faso. These are some of the landlocked countries that are held back. And then on top of that, what we're finding is that those in rural areas, they tend in particular to struggle as well, with some particular countries seeing the pandemic set them back some ways, if you focus in on Kenya and Nigeria. And then lastly, as much as we would like to see phones and smartphones become these key devices, they are the minority that's there. So there's still a journey here with the affordability of the devices that hopefully will trickle towards the drylands themselves, with secondary markets of not buying brand new phones, but getting upcycled or second-hand phones in their pockets and purses. Next slide, please. One aspect I think we have to consider, which does make for not the best reading, but is a matter of fact here, is that when we look at the countries overall, and in this case, if you were to take Nigeria and Kenya as two of them, what you find is that there's increasingly a smaller and smaller gap as far as mobile phone ownership between men and women. However, in the case of both Kenya and Nigeria, and Kenya here is sadly not leading and has a far bigger chasm, there's a gap between the number of men and women with access to the mobile internet. So there's a gendered lens, even before you look at the drylands. And then when you go to the drylands, it can get far more severe than the 42% gap that we're seeing here on the image on the bottom left-hand side. And so if you take a look at the image on the right-hand side, the pandemic set women in particular back even worse than they did men, as far as those who were basically moving from basic phones to feature phones, color screen, internet connectivity before smartphones that can multitask and have, sort of essentially full touch screens. So those women who had actually begun to move forward towards smartphones were actually set back significantly more than men during the pandemic. And there's a hope here that that'll correct itself. But as far as the drylands, there's still a gap, in some cases as big as 70 or 80% men online on social media compared to women. But this is something that's there across Africa as well. Next slide, please. Now, when we take a look at these actual devices, one of the challenges that we've got to, I guess, take stock on or pause with, previous slide, if you don't mind. I will, yeah, you can hold, yeah, this is the one. No, it's fine, it's fine. I think I skipped the slide right before this. So when we, I think, take stock of who's active on the internet and is there any good news from this, the answer is there's definitely some. So if I could just take a couple of seconds to have you imagine who is it that's actually using the internet, and then what happens particularly in the dryland. Then what we see here is on the left-hand side, consider this y-axis, the amount of time someone has. So all of us are here. Very few of you might be monitoring the megabytes this Zoom call is actually requiring of you. But for some people, they really have to conserve megabytes. And so they have to pick and choose. Am I going to be on that Zoom call? Or am I going to sort of lazily and casually stay connected all day on WhatsApp and pick and choose? On the x-axis at the bottom, this is the level of engagement. So as goes with Zoom calls, some of you might be active in the chat throughout the call. Some of you may be silent throughout, but be here the whole time. So observers on the top left-hand side, these are people with essentially low comments, not necessarily creating content, but spend a lot of time. Some of us here on this call will be lurkers, another name for observers. However, what I want you to see is the majority of people, and particularly in the drylands, tend to be functional. They spend the least time online, and this is growing. And there's some encouraging signs. I mean, when we look at what people are actually doing and where they're spending their time, there's every intention of people to exchange information on markets, to do with agriculture, and there's all sorts of new forms of entertainment, music, and culture being sent and transmitted and consumed through YouTube, through streaming sites for those who actually are participating and interacting. And then there's those just happy to comment, reach out to friends and family, and those will be people like connectors who have little time, but spend a lot of it and are very social. So the people we do see, so we saw TikTokers in various parts of the drylands, they're leaders and super leaders. They're at the top end of the spectrum. But the encouraging thing from this is that there's just as much promise in internet users who haven't migrated economically from the drylands to bigger cities. They're staying in the drylands, in particularly economic centers, and using their smartphones or cyber cafe access to interact with the web. Next slide, please. Now, these are some of the devices that are playing a role in that onboarding journey. Why? Because the actual majority of devices in the drylands are basic phones. They have no color screen, they call and text and basically stay connected for a very long time. But here we're seeing what happens when you have, let's say, $12 to spend or 20 something odd dollars, or up to a smartphone, if you will, entry level in the $30 range. And the point with all of these three devices is they each bring their own flavor of a combination of battery life. So the phone on the far left-hand side here has a battery life that can charge three of our fancy smartphones, 10,000 milliamp hours, and it's sold with a light bulb. Or if you take the smartphone on the far right-hand side, basic Android, very lean, cheap and cheerful, but just a warm and interactive experience to what's it like to have this full screen and have megabytes get consumed. So this here is presenting hopefully what we hope is a more and more affordable gateway, especially if the gender barriers can be overcome over time. Next slide, please. And sort of rounding us out in terms of like my thoughts here, the cyber cafe, for some, you might not have stepped into one for a while, but if you look at this cyber cafe menu on the right-hand side, what you'll see is that people are paying the cyber cafe to be some sort of IT shop. You walk in, you say, my WhatsApp isn't working. Or you walk in, you say, I have a brand new phone and I'd like WhatsApp. In cases like that, people are being charged for these services. Or you say, look, I think I need an email address or an email account. Or I need a Facebook account. In both of those cases, that's some of the ways that people are getting support. There's typing and secretarial services, e-government, a PIN number for your taxes or various e-government services. So the cyber cafe is actually evolving over time. And on this far left-hand side, a very encouraging image that we came across in some of our research, 3 women, 2 men. For me, a really great gender ratio right there, and all of them browsing the internet in a cyber cafe, besides everything else the cyber will be up to. The idea with all of this showing is that this continues to be a portal of service and experience for millions of people across the drylands, give or take, for those who actually will get in an economic center and get to somewhere where there's a cyber cafe still present. This is when they'll bump up from a phone to using a full QWERTY keyboard. So ultimately, what's the summary of what I've just shared? Connectivity-wise, investments being made and constraints being real. Ultimately, gender continuing to play a limiting factor in the participation of women. Some encouraging aspects like the positive information being exchanged and culture and communities coming together. And last but not least, it really showing that the cyber cafe is not a forgotten relic, but a key touch point for the future. So yeah, with that said, I think I'll hand it over to Alexis, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's always fun to hear you speak and getting excited about the mobile phone again. I think that's absolutely wonderful. So thanks to Mark and the team at Nendo, we have been able to have a better sense of kind of the key figures: internet penetration, mobile network quality, certainly gender-based access, as he says, both to devices and to connection. What I found also exciting is that Mark and the team did a wonderful qualitative evaluation of the audiences and some of the conversations going on. So as you mentioned, what are the TikTokers saying? What are people excited about on WhatsApp and Facebook? And so I think that snapshot of broadly the social media trends is kind of absolutely thrilling. So now we have an initial understanding of who's using which platforms, as I say, in what ways, and some hypotheses to start to parse those trends. And then critically, we now have a sense, again, I hope you're finally excited about the mobile phone and potentially even for social media's potential for civic participation, for e-commerce, certainly for communities' resilience in the drylands. And across all these opportunities, we're excited to start to pinpoint and deep dive on specific innovations that are using these tools of the mobile phone and social media. And Wowzy is an excellent example for that. We forecast a Spark that Wowzy is this cross-cutting service at scale, could start to promote inclusive economic growth and certainly to start to enhance access to information, not just for marketing, but also for education, extension services, and some community connection. And with that, I'd love to welcome Mike Otieno, co-founder, all-around wonderful brain behind Wowzy, to talk us through that innovation.
Thank you, Alexi. Super excited to share a little bit more about Wowzy. Yeah, let me just give a second for the slides to be put up.
As the slides are coming up, everyone, do feel free to put any questions for Mark or Alexis or Mike in the chat, and we will come back to them at the end of the presentation.
Sorry, just some technical issues. Niamber, are you able to screen share?
I'm back. I'm actually just trying to do that.
Okay.
Awesome, there we go. Awesome, yeah. So Wowzy is a creator platform. Yeah, we can even start there. It's fine. 1 second. Yeah, so we are a creator platform. We think of ourselves as delivering growth during turbulent times. We are a COVID baby, if you may, one of those startups that started in the middle of COVID in 2022. But since then, we've seen a lot of growth in terms of impact, the variety of creators we have on the platform, and also in terms of just the diversity of the messaging and the reach that the platform has been able to have. Next slide, please. So if you think about Wowzy, we are a digital marketplace for creators. And as you'll see later, we've redefined what it means to be a creator. You'll see quite interestingly. So there's also already an interesting bit there. So on the one hand, we have a digital advertising marketplace where small and medium enterprises, organizations can be able to log in and find a bunch of creators on the platform. So we have about 100,000 creators spread across 10 African countries. The platform is self-serve and demand, which means it operates through a mobile app. And as long as you have a phone, a smartphone, and internet connectivity, you can be able to access it anywhere. We also have what we call peer-to-peer methodologies, where we found that people with lower following are actually more effective in terms of engagement, in terms of the trust the communities have of them, and in terms of the conversion of these messages when they're sent. And then at the same time, it's an end-to-end managed service, which means, it's almost plug and play for any institution or organization that tries to use it. Ultimately, our mission is to create 1 million dignified jobs for African creators. And we are well on our way to do that. As I mentioned, we are at 100,000 and the growth has been exponential thus far. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I said, since COVID, the year between 2020 and 2021 was a slow year for us. But then 2021, 2022, there's a whole, 15x growth and 3x growth to date, 100,000 creators of the platform. A lot of the clients that are using the platform are what I call always on. So they're finding so much value in interacting with the creators of the platform that they're not leaving essentially. So the return on investment is quite interesting. And also something that's super interesting is 83% of the jobs being issued out of the Wowzy platforms is going to non-celebrities, which is quite interesting as well, because as you would imagine, people think creators or influencers, they imagine of celebrities, but in our platform, it's actually the reverse. Amateur creators, which could be pastoralists, moms, students, are the ones who are actually earning the most through the platform. And then if you think about the key sectors we're serving a lot of private sector folks. Procter & Gamble, for instance, will get mothers to promote Ariel washing powder for example. But on the flip side, we are working a lot with development folks, where people like Feeble will be using the platform to drive organic messaging awareness, or Spark will be working with us to figure out pastoralist influencers and people who can influence behavior within their drylands. Or UK Tech Hub may work with us to drive positive messaging around elections. So the use cases are very diverse, as you will see as we proceed. Next slide. Yeah, and as I mentioned, the growth has been exponential. We started off in Kenya, but through demand, the platform is growing into what we call anchor markets. So really, our key focus market in Africa has been Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. But we're seeing something even more interesting, where a lot more demand is coming from what we refer to as our periphery markets. So places like Mozambique, Namibia, Botswana. And by the way, this is very demand driven, where people who've worked with us in one market are like, can you replicate this model? And so as long as there's internet connectivity, people have access to phones, it's really a model that's scalable across the world, not even in Africa alone. So the goal of growth is something that Wowzy still has, and will continually be exposing this sort of model for job creation across the continent. Next slide, please. So as I said, it's not your typical creator platform. You don't necessarily expect to find Kim Kardashian there, for example, but we are really pro upcoming creators, if you may. So border riders, for instance, or motorbike drivers in Nairobi are working with us to promote cheap fuel, for example, or lower sized data bundles with a telco. So that's very interesting. Farmers are being trained and taught to become influencers through promoting their own food on Instagram Live or TikTok Live. So that's very interesting. We have tons of students across universities who are acting as ambassadors for various brands. We have fishermen working with telcos. We have moms promoting, great parenthood. And we have pastoralists who are also leveraging the platform to be able to drive whichever messaging or behavior change that is we are driving for the regions they're in. So the platform is very location-centric and is able to leverage people within location to drive social change through right messaging. Next slide. And as I mentioned, the power is in nano. The lower the followership, the higher the trust, the greater the ROI, the greater the relevance, the easier to scale. So we really focused on the millions of amateur creators on the platform. So with as little as 250 followers, you can be able to join Wowzy platform and be able to interact, be able to engage, be able to ultimately earn for your craft. So that's something that we find super interesting. Next slide. This is an example of something we are doing with Feeble, Switzerland, where we are promoting organic food. And we want to reach millions of people through organic messaging. If you go to the next slide, I'll show a very interesting dynamic campaign. So this is sort of like the framework we use from research all the way to monitoring, running campaigns, etc. But if you go to the next slide, I'll be able to just showcase a very interesting example. So this is an interesting campaign where we worked with actual farmers to get their avocado in a famous store in Kenya called the Corner Shop that was looking to shift, their produce to more organic because there's huge demand for it. We had tons of farmers in Murang'a or different parts of Kenya who never had this visibility. So Wowzy worked with the Corner Shop and farmer organizations to bring them both together on a weekend. And then we tapped into, the creator space to bring in more seasoned creators. We had a saxophone guy, we had it live on Instagram. And what we saw was very huge uptake or increase in demand for Corner Shop itself. So they actually are continuing with these campaigns. And then secondly was the farmers actually seeing where the end product end up. And they were able to interact in real time with actual, consumers. And that was quite transformative. So this is just an example of how platforms such as WOWS is able to bring worlds that naturally never meet to meet. Next slide, please. Second example is what we did with UK Tech Hub and Baraza Media Lab, just to drive messaging around misinformation. So there's a lot of misinformation around elections, and we were able to showcase this, lead people towards facts and use a pool of influencers across Twitter and Facebook to just drive peace and factual messaging. And that was another interesting case study. And then finally, if I go to the next slides, I'll be able to showcase some of the things we are actually doing with Spark as we speak. So next slide, please. So with Spark, we are working with two interesting projects in the North. One, we are calling it the Ushanga Women Empowerment Project, and the other in Savannah Circuit. Go to the next slide, I'll be able to share a little bit more for each, but these are projects that are ongoing. So the Ushanga, we'll start with this one for, highlighting impact of stories of farmers. So the idea here is we want to change behavior of pastoralists from, having their food rot to using chillers. And we are starting to showcase stories of farmers who use chillers in the North to be able to influence others, to be able to also drive this narrative. So that's a pretty interesting campaign. It's ongoing as we speak. It's multi-stakeholders. So we're working with the farm entrepreneurs, with the government and NGOs. And then we are driving that conversation as well. And then ultimately, what we are doing there is also making sure that we target the pastoralist influencers to participate in the campaign. Next slide, please. The second one is showcasing the Ushanga Empowerment Program. Again, this is where women in the North are working on developing very nice beads, and we are working with them to be able to showcase this sort of beadwork across so that we can drive a lot more uptake of their products and so on. And vice versa, we are working with a lot more urban creators to be able to drive people to move from the urban areas to the North to be able to participate in the events and the campaign. So a lot of this is stuff that we are doing. Through the WOWSI platform, we are able to measure the different level of impact. One of the things we are looking at is obviously the common things like reach, common things like sentiment, and now the sentiment is changing. And ultimately, in cases where there's an actual product being sold, we are going and tracking to the very level of, how many more is being bought or being sold based on the campaigns. So yeah, I think that's it. My time is also up, but I'll be open for questions as we proceed.
I think you're on mute, Alexis.
No, we still can't hear you, Alexis. Perhaps you could.
Well, Alexis works on her sound. I'll just pick up one of the questions from the chats about the types of innovations. that we're researching in the innovation research facility overall. So on the dashboard, we have a wide range, 60 and growing different innovations. And they all are innovations that have been established. They've been operating for at least a couple of years. But they're at different levels and they're always evolving. And so there are different levels of investment or public sector support. And what we're doing in the learning through the innovation research facility with them is understanding both what's succeeding about them and what's failing so that we can amplify those learnings for other innovators in the same space while supporting those specific innovations to grow and scale as well, or to fail smartly. So we have a wide range of innovations in the platform. Alexis, perhaps you are
Let me give this a go. Is that better? Okay,
clear.
Excellent. Thank you for your patience with that. As we say, we're learning again about tech. So hopefully got you excited about mobile phones and social media. So what I'd love to do is go back and pause and think about the tools that we've learned about today. So obviously we heard about mobile phones, the power of connectivity and the potentials that lie there from Mark. We heard about social media and this tool called social media influencing from Mike. And so through our research under Spark, we're trying to explore the potentials in a wider view of this landscape, but also the specific tools. So what I also want to start by opening with is to suggest that pastoralism itself is a sort of tool. We learn a lot from pastoralist societies on flexibility, innovation, managing resource, especially in a situation of scarcity. So I think this idea of managing variability, of managing in uncertainty is itself a tool. And I suggest that when combined, the power of the mobile phone, of social media, of this tool called pastoralism or pastoralist infrastructure, there is a lot to be unlocked. And so we're trying to explore together with all the people on this team and a number of other partners across the places that we work in, how that might look like in practice. And so before we proceed on the particularities of social media as a tool and the mobile phones and what we think is a red thread, that is livelihoods across all of them, I'll say a little bit about what I mean by pastoralism as a tool, and that might help us see how perhaps it lends itself so wonderfully to TikTok, to WhatsApp, and so on. So I would describe pastoralism in this way as a tool, as I said, as this lattice of social networks, of governance mechanisms, of knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems, and sort of cooperative leadership, all the way from your standard hierarchical understanding of leadership to a more communal, lateral sense of leadership. So that sense, that wider infrastructure really lends itself quite well to managing variability, but as you can imagine, to trending on Facebook and WhatsApp and having sort of really intricate conversations. So I hope at the end you're curious about what pastoralists are talking about on Twitter, if they are on Twitter, what they watch on YouTube, which devices they're using, but importantly, how we can start to be very deliberate about how we integrate those tools. So next slide, please. And so the key question across all the different projects we're working on right now, there are three, and I'll say more about them later, is this unifying question: can social media listening influence pastoralist futures? So now you have a sense of what social media means and kind of the key figures from Mark. You have a sense of what influencing and listening, so the communicating, but also learning from the data, that's the social media listening, and some sense of how pastoralism as a tool lends itself. So I'll say more about, I'll start with some caveats. So next slide. So as we know from Mark, there is a lot of inhibitors, which I will not get into, but some examples to give, you can read more on our website, these two blogs, is that there is some very specific regulatory, but certainly also cultural inhibitors to the uptake of these tools. And with that in mind, we wanted to design some ways to think through what those potentials are. So next slide. Okay, so here is, and I'll say more about the influence piece because that's the most, I think, compelling part of how we designed the three research projects. Next slide. And here we go. So the first one is kind of like, as I say, as an ecosystem, and you heard a preview of that information. There's a lot of rich information and data in the background from Mark, please feel free to ask further questions. So the guiding question is, what online and social media opportunities exist in the drylands? We've given you a teaser of what this might be. And then we started to ask, what is the impact of information campaigns? So that's what you heard from Mike on Savannah Circuit as an example, and Ushanga. What we're doing with those two campaigns is testing two things. Is it effective for us to communicate directly with pastoralists about, say, a new product like a chiller for their milk, or for a new business, Savannah Circuit, that's expanding into their region? But secondly, is it possible for us to change behavior? For example, convincing more pastoralist women to sell their beadwork on an e-commerce platform? Can we also convince more customers to uptake that material? Is there greater trust, using the nano influencers or the amateur creators that Mike talked about? And then the third thing that we think is also exciting, talking about scale specifically, we think that there's a lot of economic potential. So we ask, can nano influencers such as those on the platform, Wowzy, scale job creation in the drylands? So these are our three sort of sub questions, all tied to that overarching question. And what I'll do today is preview some of the insights, particularly on the job creation and the campaign, since you've already heard directly from Mark. Next slide rather. So I'll take you to my favorite place, which is the future. So here we're trying to forecast, based on the information we have and the data we've already collected, what those potentials are in a very practical way. And I hope that we sort of anchor what I offered as very large, ambitious questions by these specific hypotheses and early conclusions. Next slide. So in the first case, as I suggest, if you think about a platform like Wowzy, which essentially makes marketing much more affordable for smaller enterprises and medium-sized enterprises, if you follow that thread, the potential of one, increasing the number of businesses of that size, or at least expanding the businesses that exist in those drylands, we forecast that there is a lot of value as far as job creation and livelihood diversification. So our bet is that because it's a digital job, it's an entirely new job. It's essentially expanding the pot of income and revenue in that area, turning non-producers, someone who was on use Facebook to chat with their aunts and their family, and now give them an opportunity to earn income that was previously unthought of or unheard of for them. And we start to think, particularly with the reliance on the mobile phone, there's some opportunity for these supplementary livelihoods to be climate resilient. What that implies for us, however, and we're working with Wowzy on, is thinking about how do we calibrate decent work for seasonal digital labor? That's a fun question that I'd be happy to geek out on with you later, but we are starting to ask ourselves, how do we start to think about fair work, about meaningful work, all of this when facilitated by a digital platform, which is often very new for a lot of these populations. Some hypotheses are caring about this is very important for tech platforms and companies like Wowzy because it's accelerating the accessibility and inclusion agenda. Designing for low connectivity people starts to force you to think very differently about the mechanics and the impact of your platform or your tool. Certainly, we think there's some value here around what we call interpretization or rebundling. So when we say diversify their livelihoods, we want to think about the wider portfolio of work that pastoralists are managing. We expect that a lot of people will continue with the traditional pastoralism. So how do we layer on and bundle other services to make, on the whole, a much more enriching and inclusive portfolio of work? And as I said, could we really do at scale? Does our trajectory align? Could we start to unlock that economic value and productivity that we forecast? So those are our early ideas and concepts around job creation and livelihood diversification. Next slide. And then for folks who are finding ways to think about campaigns, communicating with people in the drylands, or at least for agenda based in those drylands, we think there is a lot of value for social media, whether or not it's through Wowzy or similar platforms or directly as a nonprofit or a government, to use social media as an alternative vehicle. So a channel for communication, but as I say, also a data source, a way to learn information through as a source of secondary information, which could be deployed for some collaborative policy making, for community-led evaluation, for those of us who are in the M&E field, and for participatory design. We think particularly it's a space where we might be able to reach those who are often underrepresented at the table when it comes to decision making. And then writ large, there is a lot of potential for civic participation and collective action. finding ways to coordinate and mobilize pastoralists who are traveling far distances becomes much less a challenging task if we have some very clever and thoughtful ways of deploying social media tools. And so for us, we think that we can start to unlock the value of community networks and start to activate nodes. Nodes are exactly, so the bet for WOWs is that those nodes are people with fewer followers because we trust them more. But we could also start to think about how those nodes apply in real life and not just on social media, and start to operationalize some of this social capital that pastoralists have already been using for many years. Next slide. And so this is all previewing some exciting reports that we're putting out. The first one is exactly a toolkit for helping you wrap your mind around, how do I use social media? How do I write the messaging? How do I track impact? How do I amplify the value of that project? In whether you're promoting a product or you're trying to get a message across and change people's behaviors. And then the other report will be digging deep on that job creation and livelihood diversification potential. So if you care about creating new jobs, if you're invested in markets, whether or not they're related to livestock, this could be an exciting report for you to look out for over the next few weeks, months rather. And thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Mark to preview how this connects with the rest of all the exciting research that Spark researchers have been leading and publishing.
Great, thanks very much. I want to make sure we leave enough time for the Q&A. Can people hear me? I don't see myself. Yeah. Perfect. Great. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, this is a terrific session. A couple of thoughts that come to mind, and I'm speaking. Thank you, Mark, for positioning me in the spectrum of social media users between, super leaders and functionals. I'm definitely on the functional side of things. And then I do use a QWERTY keyboard, so my apologies for that. But I think one of the key things for me coming out of this, I mean, this is a very optimistic story, and I think that's great. I think it's very important. I do have questions myself, and these are questions that I know are being looked at across our portfolio. I think it's very helpful to sort of have a deep view and understanding of how social media, in particular, these digital innovations are having an impact. And I think the general story is that the general hypothesis is that more information is good. With more information, people can make better choices and so on and so forth. And that's all very valid and true. I sometimes wonder, again, about some of those, some pastoralist communities that may be in regions that are much harder to reach. The sort of, and I recall reading one of the briefs that you had put together, some of the areas that are kind of the dark spots on the map where there's no digital penetration, no access to cell networks, so on and so forth. What happens in those areas? And then part of me also wonders, and I'm generally not I'm generally not a pessimist, but are there negative outcomes associated with social media? And so I don't mean to be a downer, because I just think generally this is a very positive story, and the work that you presented from WOWSy, for example, shows massive growth and potential of social media, and it's something that I think has been underappreciated. But I wonder if there is a cost to it, and what may that cost be. I think that for the Spark portfolio, we do work on a whole range of issues associated with pastoralism and agriculture in conflict-affected zones. We're now looking at, we really wrestled with this innovation story, partly because I think innovation means everything and nothing. And everybody has a different view of what is innovative versus what is not innovative. And I refer one question in the box was, how new are these innovations? Well, what might be an innovation to me may be not something that's particularly groundbreaking to someone else. And that's kind of interesting. In the discussions, we got fixated on, should we be looking at digital innovations alone? But I think Mark in his introductory comments made a very important point, that which is where Spark as a program we settled. Innovation is not only about digital innovation, but innovation is also about governance and the use of information to change practices and change behavior. That's fundamental. That is the fundamental piece. How are people using information? Where are they getting that information from? How to amplify important stories, important practices, so that others may have access to them to inform inform their choices. So it's sort of an evolving story, a very important story. And maybe I'll leave it at that. This is sort of the first cycle of innovation research, and a big thanks to Chloe and the rest of the team for really sort of outlining some of the key lessons that are coming through this work. And we do intend to go through some additional cycles of work. The Q&A. Chloe, should I hand it back to you to sort of outline some of the Q&A?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you,
Great.
Mark, for those reflections, and thanks everyone for a lot of questions in the chat. We've tried to respond to a few of them there, and then I've clustered some others and to make the most use of our time. So there's been a few questions about the nature of pastoralists on social media. Where are they on social media? What type of these engagements? What type of influencer are they? How are they engaging? What are they talking about? Are they talking about conflict? And we did get into some level of depth on that. And Niambora, if you could put up the other deck from that the Nendo team worked on, that would be great. I think slide 16 onward. And I'll invite Mark Kaigwa shortly to speak about it. But the Nendo team that we've partnered with on this really has great technology for social listening, looking at what different types of social media accounts users are talking about, following hashtags and themes. And so we dug in deep in all the 4 countries and have a lot more to share on that. I'm happy to chat with people also individually going forward. But I'll let Mark preview a little bit of an example of that from what we looked at in Kenya, so you can get a flavor. So yeah, Mark Kaigwa.
Sure, and yeah, thanks, Chloe. So yeah, I think this question had come up earlier, and the idea is to quantify it by showing that if we go with what Mike and his team at Wowsy would call either nano influencers or micro, macro, and up to meta being people with hundreds of thousands up to millions of followers, and nano really being sometimes less than 5,000 or even less than 3,000 or less than 1,000 if you're taking the drylands in particular. So when we look at Wowsy's platform, part of what we were able to see is that the majority, if you just take 2 drylands regions, one with Turkana, the other with Garissa, in both of them was actually nano influencers. And this makes sense. They tend to be the majority of influencers, people with high social capital, but somewhat low or lower numbers of total followers. And on top of that, they tend to have higher social capital because the few people who do follow them tend to trust them, take their opinion, and be somewhat, strong or loose ties to them relationally. So what we're seeing here is that in both cases, you will have, let's say, macro, and these could be musicians, these could be very sort of tech-savvy people who work at an office, let's say, at a development organization or at Garissa University or somewhere like that, have sort of what I'd call the limiting factor of megabytes and connectivity taken off, so they can just afford to get creative and create. And Mark Redwood said something just now that I think is worth spotlighting and sharing, which is, is there a dark side to part of this as positive and as great of a narrative there is? I'd say one of them really is just, there's often this idea that, oh, but it's on the internet, it's free. And the truth is it's not, in the sense that if you're looking for the one country across the world where Netflix is free, that's right, Netflix, publicly traded company, it's Kenya. And there's some very particular caveats that apply. One of them is that it's only for Android phones. 2, it's in a very sort of low fidelity of video, but they're trying something because they realize it's not enough to say Netflix is here. Even when they give it away for free, some people struggle because they have to pay with their megabytes on an ongoing basis, and particularly so in the dryland. So the people you see here are people who've signed up to Wowsy, are looking to do business with their platforms and profiles to market anything from agricultural produce to fertilizer to small businesses in Turkana and Garissa. And hopefully this is telling us part of the role of a place like the Cyber Cafe that takes away the barrier of megabytes, but at least it's telling another story for us to pick out on. So thanks, Chloe, for tending to me for this one. So I'm happy to hand it back to you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mark. And maybe just in a minute or two, if you want to share a bit more about, I think the next couple of slides in that deck also showed some examples of specific influencers in the drylands that I think would be interesting for people to see.
Yes, so I think we're going to take a look at some of the names and faces of people creating content. So as Chloe said, part of the research we do at Nendo, we have essentially a couple of research methods and also tools that let us do it at scale to look up, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of profiles, millions of online updates, and all with respect to privacy across the respective platforms. It has to be public for us to do any of this. So in this case, you see 3 different examples of Twitter influencers that we came across here. So all of whom have distinguished themselves in particular for being in Lodwar. So we both looked at their bios of where they were located, and then we'd also triangulate by looking at the geodata of the few tweets that would actually appear and tag them as being inside of that county and that territory. So you saw some interesting things here. Again, what are we seeing? It's skewing almost all male. Thankfully, with somewhere like TikTok, as we'll show you, there's a bit more gender parity with content creators. But here you have all 3 of them. The gentleman in between, sort of micro, small, and medium enterprise enthusiast, someone in business, and shares a bit about business development in that county and essentially the capital and the main city there, Lodwar. This other side, you see a gentleman who, again, is sort of internationally appealing, mentioning Manchester United support. And then the far right-hand side here, you've got somebody talking about logistics, an actual entrepreneur, and somebody in procurement with a YouTube channel. So somebody, again, who's showing, not only do I have my own personal website there and this particular Twitter account, I have my own YouTube channel too. I'm able to create content along the way. And next slide, please. For TikTok, as you see a little bit more gender parity across families, friends, content with, and we look through again, I want to say hundreds of different content creators all over these respective drylands, and look to what were they doing? Were they just reacting to dance and song? Were they doing a bit of comedy? Were they doing lifestyle content or family and personal life? In this particular case, you see, like TikTok normally is quite popular for song and dance. All you got to do, put up the camera, move to one of the popular, what are called challenges or trends, and TikTok has its own way of picking up and I guess distributing your content around the way. So for us, we see 2 out of the 3 in this case being women, in particular, as far as we could tell, and then just starting conversations and interactions with the far left. You see what's called a duet, when 2 users or 1 user responds to the other. So these for us were in Lodwar County as well. And like Chloe said, this is a smidgen of one of the various counties in Kenya, and we certainly took the chance to look at them across Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Nigeria as well. So I'll leave it there because I know other people have questions and answers as well, but thank you, Chloe, for giving me the chance to chime in.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think it's always fun to follow all of the dryland influencers accounts directly. And it's fun to share those tidbits here. Next, I'd like to also invite Mike from Wowzy to come and answer a few questions. There's a few of them asking about how Wowzy measures the impact of various campaigns, what sort of measurement metrics are built into the platform, and how they may think of additional measurements that could be done in partnership with development partners around that, as well as some questions on the side of who could run campaigns on Wowzy, who are the potential clients who has Wowzy already been talking to, and where is Wowzy thinking to go when it comes to running campaigns in the drylands. So over to you, Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, this is very useful. So yeah, how do we measure impact? It really varies depending on the campaign, but I could bundle it across what we call engagement metrics. So the beauty of social media is these can easily be found, whether it's clicks, whether it's likes, whether it's shares, whether it's comments, etc. I think a second one that's usually very useful is what we call the sentiment score. And this is a lot of it is just, language, looking at the comments themselves and dividing on whether they are positive, negative, or neutral, and being able to come up with a score in terms of what's the general sentiment a topic is having, and so on and so forth. Then I would say further end into the funnel, you might find what they call the further down the funnel, things like sales, like actual how many products were taken up, and so on and so forth. So it really depends with the campaigns. And every campaign is designed to be able to measure this sort of impact. And the latest one I've seen when we are just doing messaging campaigns have been through surveys, where we do surveys before and we do surveys after, and just to get a sense of what the difference is in terms of, do people know about what we're talking about more in a certain area or not? So it varies quite a bit, but we have mechanics within the platform itself, but also additional tools that we engage with to make sure that the impact is being measured over time. In terms of the kind of clients that are able to use Wowzy, it really cuts across. We've made the product very much self-serve and as much as possible with different tools to be able to guide people on how to use it. But a lot of it has been combination of either small, medium enterprises, and in some cases, even individuals, and some medium enterprises as well. For example, if I give 2 example companies that we are pursuing to run more campaigns in the North, we have a company like Ban Manufacturing, for example, that does low-cost stoves, that ensure less charcoal is used per cooking, period. And a lot of their clients are actually in the North, because there's not much access to gas and those types of things. So Ban Manufacturing is one. The same time, somebody like Davis and Shatleaf is another example, who are looking to drive target NGOs and development partners in those spaces to develop more boreholes for people in places without water. So those are examples of like 2 that off my mind, I can imagine, but we're really having conversations with them to encourage them that, hey, there's opportunity within the North, and we can be able to run campaigns that drive this sort of behavior change within the localities.
Thank you so much, Mike. And it looks like we're just about at time. I think we could continue these conversations for a long time. But I know that we're all keen to continue engaging with you. So feel free to reach out to myself, Mike, Mark, Alexis as well for any follow-up conversations, and building into what research we can continue along these lines next year. But thank you all very much for your time. And we'll wrap up for today.